Happy holidays, everyone. This year I decided to do something a bit different for the holiday special. Normally, whenever a holiday rolls around, I try to do a singular review, usually of something that is either appropriate for the season, or if it's not necessarily specific to the holiday season, it's something that is highly requested, or just something that I really look forward to taking a look at on the channel. But without going into too much detail here, because I don't want to bore you with my personal problems, I have been unusually stressed out about a wide variety of things over the past year, and it has definitely impacted what I have been trying to do on the channel. It may not necessarily be as obvious until the last couple of months where video production has slowed down, but funnily enough, that actually wasn't due to stress. That was due to changing my work schedule and having to adjust to it because it was a very different work schedule than what I was doing previously, so I just didn't have the time or energy to work on videos at that point. And depending on my lack of time and energy and stress levels, I wasn't even necessarily able to work on getting games finished in order to eventually review them. Because contrary to popular belief, reviewing a video game is not as simple as you play the game and then you write an opinion piece afterwards. If you're going into a game knowing that you're going to be making a review of it, whether it be a written or video review or whatever, then your play experience is going to be very different from someone who's just picking up the game to try to enjoy it. You're going to be constantly keeping an eye out for glitches, whether it be nuisance glitches, like physics glitching out occasionally, or outright game-breaking glitches. You're going to be constantly looking for things like performance drops. You're going to have performance monitoring on and paying attention to it pretty much the entire time you're playing. You're going to be paying a lot more attention to the way the writing is structured and the way the dialogue is written and performed. And you're going to be paying a lot more attention to how the mechanics are set up and function than any normal player is ever going to do. And you have to do all of this regardless of whether you're enjoying the game or not. If you happen to be enjoying the game while also assessing it critically like that, then great, but if you're not enjoying it, which is what ends up happening with a very large number of games that end up being downright crap or just mediocre, then you can't simply do what most players would do at that point, which is stop playing and potentially seek a refund. If you intend to review something, you are still obligated to either outright finish the game, or if you somehow can't bring yourself to finish it, you still need to bring your critical assessment to bear in some sort of article or video or whatever medium you are operating in. And that is all additional hours and potentially even additional days spent working on something that you frankly aren't enjoying, but you feel obligated to do anyway. And then once you've got your assessment of the game put together and released to the public, then there's the response that you have to put up with. Now, of course, some of that response is going to be quite positive. I have had plenty of comments saying, hey, thanks for showing this game to me and giving me an advisement on it because I picked it up and I've been thoroughly enjoying it. Or you run into people who already enjoyed the game and say things like, oh, you said this thing about it. I hadn't thought about it in that way, and then it made me look at the game in a different way, and now I appreciate it more. And then, of course, there's the other positives, like if you review a crappy game and you say, hey, this game is crap, don't waste your money on it, you'll get some responses thanking you for your assessment of the game because it helped them save some money on what would have otherwise been a poor purchase. Then, of course, there's the opposite end of the spectrum, all of the negativity you'll receive because how dare you criticize any particular game? Because obviously being critical of a consumer product means that you are a narcissistic, loathsome piece of filth who thinks that everyone else is wrong, that your own opinions are 100% fact, and anyone who disagrees with you is a moron, and you just are an absolutely miserable, loathsome piece of filth who wants everyone else to be as miserable as you, and thus, because you hate everything, you must make everyone else hate everything too. Yeah, we get some pretty unhinged comments sometimes, but anyway, point here is that, to sum all this up, the process of reviewing games is work. It's not entertainment like you would normally expect playing video games to be. I know that sounds ridiculous to those of you who've never tried to do it before, but the process of trying to review video games is work. It is ultimately mentally draining work, and when you get those responses, the positive ones tend to be invigorating because that is why you're making the review in the first place. You are ultimately trying to help people avoid wasting their money on mediocre or crappy games and help them find games that are actually worth their time and money and that they'll hopefully be be far more satisfied by. But even when things are firing on all cylinders, and you're getting all of those positive responses and being invigorated by them, it's still ultimately mentally draining work, and you're not always going to be in the right mindset to be able to do that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to completely avoid the genre of thing that you are ultimately making an assessment of. Just because I'm not in a mental state to make a review doesn't necessarily mean I'm not going to play video games at all. It just means that I'm not necessarily going to focus on the thing that I'm actually trying to review at that particular point. And I ended up coming to the conclusion that that might actually be an interesting video to make as well, just talking about all the games I messed around with this year when I wasn't really in the right mindset to work on reviews. So, let's just go ahead and start delving into that. I'm actually going to start by going off of my Steam replay for this year, because that's actually what brought this to my attention in the first place. I spent an awful lot of time this year messing around with RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress. Now, I made a video on Dwarf Fortress as my holiday special for 2022, and I reviewed RimWorld at the start of 2024, so I'll go ahead and link both of those videos so you can take a look at them and give them a watch and get the actual critical assessment of them if you haven't seen those already. But they're games I just keep coming back to, both because they're absolutely fantastic and because I don't really need to think about them in the same way that I normally do when I'm making a review. Now sure, I do still need to make a video specifically on the Anomaly expansion for RimWorld, but I only picked that up at the beginning of December, so most of the time I spent messing around with RimWorld this year, which was apparently 26% of the total playtime of everything that I've messed around with on Steam this year, which is incredibly impressive. But anyway, most of that time was spent playing it without the Anomaly expansion, and without even worrying about whether I was going to make any videos out of it. Didn't have to worry about only playing the vanilla experience. I could throw whatever mods in there I wanted. I could run it with developer mode on if I wanted to. And since I'm completely comfortable with the way RimWorld plays, I didn't need to worry about learning any new mechanics or anything until I got the Anomaly expansion. So I was able to just mess around with the game and sort of zen out playing it, and that was incredibly useful in times where I was either stressed out and couldn't focus on anything, or I just wasn't otherwise in the right mindset to work on a review. And it was a similar story with Dwarf Fortress. Just like with RimWorld, I'm very comfortable with the way Dwarf Fortress plays, at the very least Fortress mode. I'm not as comfortable with Adventure mode, but to be fair, that's not in the Steam release yet, so still waiting on that. It's in the beta branch, but not in the standard branch. Anyway, point is that I could just mess around with Dwarf Fortress in a very similar way. I could run it with mods if I wanted to, and at this point I generally do run it with mods. And just like with developer mode in RimWorld, I could run Dwarf Fortress with DFHack if I want to, and use all of the crazy tools that that gives you to mess around with the game. I could just sort of zen out, build a fortress out to see what kind of wacky things I could do with it, see what kind of wacky events would happen, because of course it's Dwarf Fortress. No matter what you do, whether you're using DFHack to smooth things out or make a fortress quickly or whatever, you're gonna end up with wacky events. So if I wasn't in the right mindset, I could just hop into Dwarf Fortress, build something out, and just see what happens. But while those two games took up the biggest chunk of time spent messing around with stuff when I wasn't really in the right mindset to work on reviews, there were actually a couple of other games that I messed around with in a similar capacity, but I did actually intend to make videos on them, and just haven't yet. So eventually you're going to see proper critical assessments of these, but I wanted to go ahead and mention them. And they are the two Stardew Valley-esque farming life simulation type games, Coral Island and Sunhaven. There's also the honorable mention of something that I messed around with a fair bit last year, but didn't make a video on yet, which was Roots of Pacha. It's in a similar vein. They're all Stardew Valley-esque life and farming sim type games where you cultivate your farm, you cultivate your crops, you cultivate relationships with villagers and such like that. And they all have different themes. So Roots of Pacha is themed after the Stone Age, which is what makes that one interesting. Whereas Coral Island is more of an ecological theme. You go to this island, there's oil spills all over the place. You help to clean up all the mess there, you help to revitalize the island and that sort of thing. And then Sunhaven has a more fantasy theme to it, so you have actual mages and things like that. And I haven't made individual videos on any of these and haven't even included them in multi-game MTOs yet, because in the case of Coral Island and Roots of Pacha, they've just felt blatantly unfinished, and they've had features that were in the works for quite a while and still aren't necessarily implemented. There are roadmaps in place and such like that. The developers of Coral Island in particular have taken an awfully long time to get all of the features into the game. So even though it is past its 1.0 release at this point and is no longer considered an early access, it still feels like an early access game. And Roots of Pacha is kind of the same way, where it is technically finished as far as all the core features go, but they're still adding stuff in and it still doesn't really feel finished. Meanwhile, in Sunhaven's case, I just haven't finished the main storyline yet, but in all three games' cases, even when I have looked at them more critically, I haven't really come to any interesting conclusions with them, because they all do more or less what Stardew Valley does, but not quite as refined as Stardew Valley. And most of the issues I have had with the games are just that they're not necessarily feeling finished, and they're still working on adding the content into the game that would make them feel finished. To oversimplify it a bit, they're just not all that interesting to do critical assessments of, because there's just not a whole lot that's truly wrong with them. And even the issues the games do have are just some mild annoyances, really. Just a few technical problems here and there, or of course the aforementioned just not really feeling finished, and so there's certain events and mechanics and such that feel a bit undercooked, and they've been working on implementing updates for them. And actually that leads me into something that may amuse you, which is that it's fairly frustrating trying to do a critical assessment of a game like, say, Coral Island, Sunhaven, Roots of Pacha, or of course Stardew Valley. Because while assessing things like the technical aspects of the game, how well it's put together, how well it runs, whether there's glitches or anything like that, is fairly straightforward, once you start delving into the particulars of what makes these games what they are, you end up in very subjective territory very quickly, and a lot of it really just becomes a matter of personal preference. Because since Stardew Valley more or less perfected the general gameplay mechanics of this style of game, there hasn't really been much in the way of mechanical innovation. Most of these games just more or less copy and paste what Stardew Valley did in terms of the general mechanics, and then they try to put their own spin on things, their own flavor, and it's really going to be up to the individual player whether that flavor ends up working out for them. That's of course not to say that you can't do critical assessments of games like this, it's just to say that the process of doing so is just nowhere near as interesting as trying to assess other types of games. And when so much of your critical assessment is just going to boil down to, how does this compare to Stardew Valley, that's frankly just not all that interesting to talk about. So who knows when I'll actually do proper critical assessments of these, but I wanted to bring them up since I have put quite a lot of time into them over the past couple of years, but I just haven't made videos about them, and I haven't even done DW Plays videos of them, because they aren't really the kind of game that is conducive to that format either. And I know it's probably going to sound very weird that those were the extent of the games I messed around with simply for personal relaxation this year, but that actually covers it. Everything else that I messed around with this year, I've either already made a video on, or in the case of something like Titan Quest, I streamed it, which, thank you to those of you who tuned in for those streams. I'm planning on doing more of those, but I just don't know when that's going to happen. Because the simple fact of the matter is that whenever I'm planning on doing a live stream, I have to have several hours blocked out to where I know that I'm not going to be interrupted during them. And I just don't know how that's going to work out until usually the week of, or maybe even the day of. So we'll just have to wait and see when the next live stream is going to be. But again, everything else that I messed around with this year, I've already either made a major video on, either a review or an MTO or something like that, or it's in the works, but I just haven't finished the video yet. I know that makes it sound like I don't play video games for my own enjoyment anymore, but obviously I do, and in this particular year's case, a lot of that involved just going back to RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress because, well, I just really enjoy RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress, and if you have even the slightest interest in them, I highly recommend checking out my videos on both of those subjects. They will, of course, be linked in the description, and they should have come up on the cards at some point in the video as well. But even among the various games that I did work on for the sake of videos, that's not to say that I universally universally didn't enjoy playing any of them, but a lot of the ones that I messed around with this year were fairly crappy games, or at the very least were kind of mediocre. So here's hoping that I'll be covering a lot more interesting and enjoyable games in the coming year. I mean, there are a few things that I'm definitely looking forward to, like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and I do also have a few videos planned for some games that I know are actually quite good, so hopefully that'll be a lot more invigorating than this year, and I won't feel the need to go back to stuff like RimWorld, Dwarf Fortress, and so on quite as often just to recharge the batteries. I'll still, of course, be playing RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress all the time because, well, they're RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress, and I just enjoy the crap out of them. But hopefully the year won't be so full of stress and exhaustion that I end up constantly going back to them just because I don't have the energy for anything else. We'll just have to wait and see, though. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like this kind of end-of-the-year informal chat roundup kind of thing, then please let me know, and let me know if you'd like to see more of this kind of thing. If it turns out that you all like this sort of thing a lot, then I'll consider doing more of them. At any rate, I need to get back to working on a few things to round out the year and then move on into the new year, so stay tuned for all of that. Again, thank you all very much for watching, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider doing so on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option's there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. You'd be amazed how even $1 a month can help out. Here's hoping 2025 will end up being a good year, but we'll just have to wait and see on that. I'll see you all in later videos.